Today's episode is actually pretty spectacular. We have Andrew Davie, who is a Renaissance man who is explaining to us his experience of getting to know himself again after a traumatic brain aneurysm.
But I also thought I would always either get married or settle down or start a family or do something. And after the aneurysm, I could intellectually understand that, okay, this is a beautiful person and I should be physically attracted to them. And none of that was there anymore.
But there is something about the ability to be more in the moment, to look at the future as kind of a gift. Restoration is a sixth phase. Like the sixth phase in some theories is moving on and recreating your life and restoring in a new way. So I'm really digging how you talk about this.
This podcast represents the opinions of our hosts and guests. The content here should not be taken as medical advice and is for informational purposes only. This podcast also does not establish a standard of care, doctor-patient, or client relationship. No guarantee is given regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast or website. And because each person is so unique, all listeners are encouraged to connect with counseling and medical professionals for assistance with their personal journey. All people, places, and scenarios mentioned in the podcast have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved.
Welcome to We're Not Fine. I'm Dr. Talia Jackson.
And I'm Doug Jensen. We thank you for listening every week to our deep and thought-provoking conversations about relationships.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of We're Not Fine.
We're so happy you're here.
We are. How are you today?
We've missed you. You know what?
Tell me.
I slept like
That's
a
magical.
dream.
Sleep being one of the key ingredients to wellness.
I am so fresh and buoyant, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
Wow.
I know.
I did see your tail walking in, and it did look a little more bushy than usual.
And bouncy.
Yeah.
And we had such a fun night last night.
Yeah?
Rob and I just hung out, had a bonfire. It was like 35 degrees, but a real crisp.
I think that's perfect bonfire weather.
It was.
Yep.
It was like crisp and the sun was setting and it was just really magical.
Yep.
And I realized how much I love just hanging out outside. I cannot wait for more outside time.
I can't either. And it's going to be, we have really weird huge ranges of temperature. So it's going to be beautiful next week.
Which is why our clinical diagnosis of Minnesota weather is bipolar 1. Doug thinks I'm so funny.
I think that's so funny.
Genuinely. Doug's been busy. Do you remember Poseidopus?
Oh, guys. So, for anybody who has a sleeve tattoo, you know that this is a really long experience. And one of my besties is the guy who does my tattoos, and he started my tattoo. We did the first 6+ hours maybe on Friday. So yesterday for me was recovery.
Yes.
Like,
I can't imagine.
Like make sure the juice is on it and make sure it's clean and all that sort of thing. Anyway, the aftercare.
And I remember
I can't go in the hot tub for a couple weeks, which is really awful.
What are you going to do?
I don't know.
20 hours of your week.
Yeah, he was really nice and said, I can go in the hot tub anytime. How about you? I'm like, that's not really nice.
No, because you don't want it like shriveled.
But I will tell you two things. One is, the first sleeve that I had that he did, he was like really respectful and really considerate.
You guys weren't just close.
We were not. And now that we're like brothers, he's a little more like just shut the F up and stop talking to other guests.
He's more himself.
Can you lean in and say this?
Oh, shut the up, Doug.
I think he's more himself, which is questionable.
Puts you in your place a little bit more. He doesn't just placate.
But I will also tell you that the nice piece about having a tattoo artist who knows you really well is that he instinctually kind of knows what I'm looking for and who I am and what is meaningful. And I have a dragon with my kids in the heart of the dragon symbolically on one side now. And I'm just incredibly mesmerized by the ocean. And I love jet skiing in Key West, despite that everyone knows that I can't swim. I love being out there. It is probably where I feel the most kind of centered and at peace, funny enough,
and
while
so,
I'm jet skiing at many miles an hour.
Is your new tattoo some like brown seaweed with like a syringe wrapped in it?
Lots of litter.
Plastic bags.
No, I wanted some ocean theme, but I also love the mystical creatures. I don't know if people can see.
It's spectacular.
So I'm doing, I don't know how to do this.
Oh, Doug's going to get canceled after this episode.
I am going to get canceled.
For sure.
So this is the beginning of my tattoo, and it is a sea serpent. And I will tell you something, guys, 2 things. First of all, I looked at it yesterday, and as anybody also knows from me, I'm very emotional about my tattoos. They have to be very personal, and they have to feel like me. And the way that he made this serpent's face and the look on the face is so me that I looked in the mirror yesterday morning and I started getting teary. I'm like, This is so a part of who I am. And so I am incredibly grateful. I can't wait to continue talking to him about it. But the other thing that is a little bit different is that when he's right on the bone and just using his gun to just dig in, I finally said, are you doing that on purpose?
Did he have like a look of pure schadenfreude?
Well, he was a little
on
bit.
His face?
I was sending you videos because you wanted updates, and as I was taking one video, he gave the finger to the camera, and I said, "This is for Talia." And
he called you a big baby for like texting all the time and stuff.
He did call me a baby, and then he called me. Yeah, he called me a baby and a prima donna. Like, you need to keep taking. How dare
you? When I think Doug, I think stoic.
I think stoic. I think really humble.
Emotions and words.
Introverted, shy.
Just like
don't
leaving
talk much.
Space for others. So much space.
What?
Nothing but space. I love you. Do you want to hear about my tattoo story?
Do you see why I just let you open up that? Yeah. But anyway, yeah.
Anyway.
I don't need to talk about me.
My tattoo. It was similarly like amazing, super cool experience.
Yep.
It really wasn't. I had the opposite. It was like the cheesiest. I'm
going to sneeze.
Okay, I'm going to keep talking.
Okay, maybe.
Did I scare it back up with my glare?
Yeah.
So I was 15 years old. My God, the age of my eldest son. He's actually turning 16 in a week. But I decided that I needed a butterfly tattoo on my ankle.
Yep. Oh,
and
that's so uncommon.
It was so uncommon, just like everyone else that's 46 right now. I don't need that kind of drama. You know that everyone.
Do you have live, laugh, love
in their 50s
written on yourself somewhere?
A Poseidopus tattoo. It's so unoriginal. Unoriginal. Now back to my story. My mom had to sign something for me to get the tattoo. She was actually going to get a matching tattoo. And my parents, I can't believe it, but they made me write like a 5-paragraph plea, a convincing argument about why I needed this tattoo. And so when my mom and I actually went, she came with me to get it. She was so horrified by the process that she bailed and she never got her matching tattoo.
I'm going to take her now.
Oh, you should totally get her a sleeve.
I should absolutely get her a sleeve with a bunch of butterflies. Just make it a butterfly sleeve.
Yeah, because it's cutthroat. Eat, pray, love. Live, laugh, love.
It's tight.
Dude.
Tight.
I don't have serpents attacking each other.
Oh my God. This one means so much to me. Plus the artistry of my friend, if anyone wants a reference.
He is so freaking talented.
This is crazy. This one is really crazy. I look at it. I don't understand how someone does what he does.
I know. It's like, that's when you know you're in the right field.
Yeah. I'll get permission from him to say where he works and what his name is.
Okay.
Yeah. I just adore this.
If tattoo. He says yes, look in the show notes and you'll find out where Doug gets his tattoo.
Yeah, I got to tell you guys, he just gets better and better. This one is so crazy beautiful, though.
It is. I think my tattoo artist, his name was like Mr. Pain or like the Destroyer.
That's a made-up name.
Or something.
I don't support that. I think you take my person is using his real name. Everybody knows my roommate, so he also lives with me.
Today's episode is actually pretty spectacular. We have Andrew Davie, who is a Renaissance man who is explaining to us his experience of getting to know himself again after a traumatic brain aneurysm that...
You almost said injury.
I did.
But you went aneurysm.
Yes, because it isn't actually considered a TBI. We
Yeah.
learned a lot. You guys are going to love him. I don't know if it makes me have more existential angst or more existential peace. I'd be curious to know what you guys think of that. But one thing for sure is that it was a great interview and he was so fascinating.
Everybody enjoy. And there will likely be a part 2 as we conclude this particular episode.
You'll see. We had more questions. Take care, you guys.
Take care. We're so excited to have Andrew Davie with us today. Andrew is a true Renaissance man. He's taught English and writing all over the world. He's an author of crime fiction novellas. God, I love that word. Short stories, and wrote a memoir called Land of Illusions about dating, managing OCD, and recovering from a brain aneurysm, which he's going to show us his T-shirt at some point. There it is. God, that is so good. And he is a fellow podcaster as the co-host of the show Happy Hour with Heather. I have Talia and you have Heather. Welcome, Andrew.
That's right.
I know.
The co-host.
Yeah. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure.
So we have you on today because you experienced something in 2018 that so few people know about, talk about, have experienced, lived to tell the tale. And you survived a ruptured brain aneurysm and subarachnoid, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, hemorrhage. And we're dying to know about your experience. Like, what happened? How did it feel? Take us through, if you would.
Well, yeah, sure. Thank you. Well, first of all, you pronounced that correctly. So well done.
Good job.
I always think arachnoid is some sort of like a spider.
That's arachnid.
Arachnid, yeah.
Close.
Well, I would learn a lot about this. My brother's a doctor, so he would explain a lot of the, well, I'll get to that. So to give you some context, I had been teaching English to high schoolers at an independent school for students with ADHD and learning differences.
Wow.
Oh, awesome.
Okay. Yep.
So that's what was happening in 2018. And the first crime fiction book that I would publish was accepted to come out the following year. So I was very much riding a high. And I had decided, rather than stay with teaching, which had always been more of a job to pay the bills for me, that I would really try to immerse myself in the creative writing world. So I thought I would apply to PhD programs and get a doctorate in creative writing.
Wow.
So flash forward, it's the summer. I don't renew my contract at school because I'm going to, make a difference in my career. And the night before I'm scheduled to fly to go visit my parents in South Carolina, I go out to a concert with a friend of mine in Washington, D.C. It's a great time. I feel fine. I'm excited. The next day, I'm going to go down to South Carolina to visit my parents. My brother and his family are already here, so it's going to be like a nice family vacation. And I get to the airport to board my flight, which I think was like a 9 a.m. flight. And when I get to my gate, I just start to sweat uncontrollably. Like more, just finish a marathon type sweating that really wasn't triggered by, it couldn't have been triggered by anything I had just done.
Mm-hmm.
And this is before COVID. So I'm just thinking, okay, well, this is strange, but maybe I'm coming down with a flu or something like that. And they call my group to board, and I lift my backpack, and it feels like there's cinder blocks in there. Mm. And again, in hindsight, I'm thinking, okay, these are 2 red flags. But in the moment, all I'm thinking is, I'll get on the plane, I'll take a nap. I might be coming down with something. I'll feel better. So I get to the gate, I scan my ticket, and then the floor begins to shift like I'm at a fun house in a carnival.
Oh, my God.
And I still wasn't thinking clearly that anything was wrong. I thought, I'm going to have to get enough momentum to somehow propel me onto the plane through this moving floorway. So I took a step and I fell down on the jetway. And fortunately, because I was in a public place in front of people, first responders were able to get to me very quickly.
Wow.
And seriously, thank goodness.
Yeah. I mean, I have thought about it since then, if I'd been in the bathroom or on the plane or in my home or anywhere else, it wouldn't have played out well. So I remember being fitted with a neck brace and put on a crash pad and telling the first, hearing don't move and just thinking, okay, I won't move. That's probably good advice. And then saying to whomever it was, I can't miss my flight, because my first thought is my mom's going to be really pissed that I'm late.
Right. Like you had no idea what had just happened.
No, none. Now, most people who have what I had experience something called a thunderclap headache, which is tantamount to the worst headache you've ever had. I didn't have that. I was really fortunate that I didn't have anything painful. It was just, I felt. So the first responders are addressing me, and then I lose consciousness, which I don't regain cognizance for the next 3 weeks.
Oh my gosh.
I go into surgery, and at the time I was taking a JetBlue flight, and I'd filled out the emergency contact info. So they called my mother to say that I'd missed my flight, that I'd fallen and missed my flight, but that's all the information that they knew. So while I was in surgery, my doctor's assistant found my cell phone and saw a bunch of missed calls. So he called what turned out to be my brother and said, you all need to come up to DC because it's really serious. Your brother's in the hospital.
Did they think that you were going to die? Do a lot of people die from brain aneurysms?
Yeah. So what I've learned is having an aneurysm is actually somewhat common. I think 1 in 50 people will develop an aneurysm. Now that's not bad by any stretch. Most people will have them and never know about it for their entire life. It's just the potential is there. So an aneurysm is when a blood vessel ruptures or a vein, something ruptures. It can happen anywhere through the body. Might happen to be in the brain. So all that means is just people will find out that potential is there. So then they'll get it tended to ahead of time. If it ruptures, I think the statistics are that 50% of all people die immediately, and then another percentage die usually on the way to the hospital. It's not a very good outcome.
No.
You are indeed a survivor.
Wow. And is it considered a traumatic brain injury? Is that what you consider it to be?
So a traumatic brain injury is typically when an external thing happens. So if you have a car accident or you're in a fight or you're assaulted and you sustain a head injury from an outside, an acquired brain injury is if it's genetic or inherited or if you have something like what I had. So I had an acquired brain injury.
Wow.
So Andrew,
yes,
if you might go back a little bit, you were telling the story about, and I'm fascinated. Of course, we've kind of focused on relationships. You were talking about your siblings and your family were contacted when you were in the hospital. Can you continue on from that? I'm kind of fascinated with your
how the
So, well, originally my brother thought it was me calling because it was my phone number. So I think he probably greeted the assistant with a snarky comment. And once they learned everything was where it was, they immediately made plans. I think my brother and his wife and son, who turned out to be integral in keeping everybody, calm during what was happening, because he was only a few months old. So I think my brother and sister-in-law drove my parents' car up from South Carolina, and my parents flew. So I was in intensive care after that for the next 3 weeks. I've seen videos of me doing things like feeding myself for the first time and answering questions. I have no memory of it, so it's very surreal. And my parents would sort of come to the hospital every day and go through the rounds with the doctors. My brother was integral in sort of translating things from like medical jargon. I think there were a few moments. I think I had a bleed that was potentially life-threatening, and there were a lot. I had a Foley catheter, which means that you can move with it in, but I still didn't realize that I could just go to the bathroom. So I kept trying to get out of bed to go to the actual bathroom.
Yeah.
And the first night I managed to get out of bed, I slipped my restraints and I managed to get out of bed, and I broke my nose because I fell on the floor.
No.
So I had to have a sitter with me.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are all, and there are some other funny, it's strange now to say funny, but enough time's gone by.
It's funny the things we can look back on and laugh about.
Well, I really enjoy the line from, I think he was the first host of The Tonight Show. He said, comedy is just tragedy plus time.
Was that Jay Leno?
Or Johnny Carson?
No,
Johnny Carson.
Yeah.
I think it was before, may have been Jack Parr.
Oh, like back
wow, way back.
But there is
way back.
That comedy and tragedy, it is. That's why so many amazing comedians, their stories are full of trauma, and that's how they cope.
Well, so at one point, my parents needed to access my laptop to get information, and I wouldn't give them the password because I said you have to protect that information. Another time, I was somehow under the impression that an assassin was going to come and murder everyone. So I said, we need to leave. And my mother said, don't worry, the assassin called and I talked to him and we canceled, so he's not coming.
Your mom is amazing. She she was just meeting you in whatever hallucination, delusion was happening in that moment and talking you through it.
Absolutely. And I said, okay, great. That's wonderful. We don't have to worry about that. So intensive care, and then I regained cognizance when I was in recovery, doing inpatient rehab. So
what did that entail, Andrew?
So I had speech therapy where someone would come to my room and we would work on, worksheets about, I at the time, and I didn't really realize this until like the first month I was out, my ability to make connections abstractly was gone. So a lot of worksheets were things like, there are 3 dogs and 3 owners, and the 3 dogs have 3 different collars, and you have to pick which dog is which with owner and collar. Yeah. And that was really difficult. And then occupational therapy was stuff like they had a bathroom recreated at the hospital and a kitchen. So you would take out cans and stack them and then put them back. And then physical therapy was just, for me at the beginning, a lot of it was just walking around the hallway and, taking like 30 seconds to walk and then sitting in a wheelchair because I didn't have the strength. So very basic sorts of things. And that was about a 10-day stretch.
Andrew, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to say, Andrew, as you're telling us this story, not only are you so articulate about the physical symptoms that kind of were going on prior to this, that, I can imagine a lot of us who might be ultra sweaty, I would think, I ate something, I'm having gallstones, or, even though my gallbladder's out now. But that was my experience. I was sweating profusely before my gallstone attack. So it's really interesting that you articulate that. But boy, your recovery process, the cognitive testing, the memory issues. One of the things that I think about any sort of acute health issue like this, and by the way, of course, you survived a near-death experience. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress, comes up as kind of an experience that I imagine you've had. But, I wonder about grief. I wonder about, as you look back at these pictures and you see yourself learning to eat for the first time, I'm kind of curious how you've articulated one of the things that I was curious about, which is like how your family responded. But, your mom in particular might have been incredibly resilient and just kind of go with the flow and have some fun with you. But I'm curious if you might talk about the grief process as you recovered and realized what happened and where you were at in your life then.
Because you were just in the middle of all of these huge things, like just at the peak.
Well, what I learned is that the physical recovery happened separately than the emotional recovery for me.
Yeah.
So at first, I sort of understood that something really traumatic had happened, that I didn't really have time to process what had actually happened. It wasn't until, I would say, the physical recovery happened in the first year for the most part. I had to walk with a cane for a while, and I could only walk for short distances. I had double vision, which slowly healed. The grief process and kind of reconciling what had happened didn't really take place until that was sort of tapering off. And that was probably the biggest hurdle that I faced, and this is still one of the other things, is that my ability to make emotional connections is still somewhat blunted. So I can still experience joy and sadness, but sadness is more just like intellectually I understand, okay, this should be making me cry, and it's not. So I just don't have the response to it.
So when you have that experience, though, Andrew, when you feel like you should be crying, but you're not, which does it make you feel, I guess, upset in any way that you don't feel normative, or is it an acceptable experience?
Now it did.
Yeah.
There was a point where I sort of thought, so I moved back home to my apartment after I got out of the hospital. My mother stayed with me. We were there for a few weeks, and then we both decided to move back to my parents' house because it would be easier. So I was back here for a few months recovering. I guess this is sort of probably the end of 2018, beginning of 2019. And then I was going to go back to my apartment and substitute teach at my old school. And I sort of felt like, oh, I'll just be returning to my life.
Right.
This period will have ended. I will have recovered, and I will just, like putting on a suit of clothes that still fit.
Right.
I'll just be going back to things.
That's such a good metaphor.
Thank you. What I didn't realize is that now I had assumed that writing and having a book published would somehow change my life anyway. When the book finally did come out and nothing changed, that was sort of a big hurdle to adjust to as well. But I also thought I would always either get married or settle down or start a family or do something. And after the aneurysm, my emotional connections just weren't there. I could intellectually understand that, okay, this is a beautiful person and I should be physically attracted to them, and I should want to either go out on a date or have sex with them.
That's
and
right.
None of that was there anymore. So that was a big change where I suddenly thought, well, if that was what I thought life was all about, settling down and starting a family and being an author, and that's not a possibility anymore, then what's the point?
I am fascinated to find out and feel comfortable not answering this. Has your libido, has your sexual interest resumed, or is it still okay?
No, that's still I've adjusted to the fact that it's all the emotions that I would like to experience, even the ones that we don't enjoy, are all still in there.
Yeah.
And we'll get to living with my parents, but my mother currently goes to play bridge with friends every week, and we were there a few weeks ago, and one of my mother's friends, who I had just met for the first time, I suddenly found myself aroused, and I was thinking, wait a second, it's been over a year since this is, so it's in there, and sadness too is in there, I think. But I've adjusted and felt comfortable with the fact that there's a lot of opportunity for me still that may not look like what I had imagined my life would look like.
Right. I mean, which is like, it's a part of this grief process of like thinking you're going to put on the same suit that you've always worn and be excited about the same things and just get back to your old self and your old life. And it's just unbelievable to think about the experience of truly having to get to know yourself as a stranger and having all of your wants, needs, desires, the way you experience emotion, unfamiliar and unpredictable.
Yeah, it took, I would say overall, it probably took about 3 years for me to begin to feel comfortable moving forward. COVID turned out to be a bit of a silver lining because at the time, substitute teaching didn't really work out at my old school. If you're going to work with that population, you really need to be at 100%. So I was able to get a job as a tutor at a tutoring center, and the job was supposed to begin in April of 2020. So that job was canceled. And I found myself just being at home with nothing to do. So my mother said, well, why don't I drive up? I'll pick you up and I'll take you back home. So I spent the next 13 months living with my parents again during COVID, which was actually great because I could just focus on recovering. And I didn't have to think about, what I was going to eat that day or where did I need to go shopping or little things that were just suddenly taken care of.
The life maintenance, the basics. Andrew, I'm so curious about the memory piece and of sort of waking up to yourself again over a number of years. Did you remember who you were, what you loved, your behavior? Were you remembering what you were like, and were you behaving the same, acting the same? Like, did you have to hear from your friends and family, like, wow, you've changed so much, or you're still the same person? Like, what was that like?
No, I was very much still the same person. Okay. Same sense of humor, same wants, desires. I mean, essentially the same thing. Yeah. Whether or not they still resonated with me was the only thing. But that was actually my brother's primary concern during my recovery, was that the person he knew his whole life wouldn't be there anymore. Yeah. But all of my memory is still pretty much intact. I mean, I don't remember those 3 weeks in intensive care, but everything else is still there. I still make the same jokes and the same pop culture references.
But your emotional experience and interpersonal experience is blunted.
It's a little different. Okay. Again, it's been almost 6 years now, so I've pretty much adjusted. The other, I still, my balance still isn't great. And when I move my head laterally, it takes time for my vision to settle. It's sort of like the sensation when you step off a merry-go-round. So
like vertigo.
A little bit, but I don't get nauseated, and it usually goes away after a few seconds. So I've just incorporated that into my everyday life. So a lot of who I used to be is still there. It's just either I've adjusted to incorporate the new elements, or enough time has gone by that it doesn't feel strange anymore.
Wow. I really want to, boy, Andrew, that's a really powerful description. You said something about like this, you are the same person, but the connections are not resonating with you about those experiences. So it's a really interesting sort of thing for even myself to wrap my head around. So you know who you were, you have the same humor, you are the same person, and yet the emotional part is so different for you. And even when we talk about the attraction piece in terms of relationships and sexuality and whatnot, that is not there. Do you feel like your grief process is chronic? Do you feel like it's every day you wake up and you have to remind yourself, so I don't have these things, but I have these things? Tell me about
Yeah, it had been that. So
Okay.
when things were difficult, especially like during COVID, I realized, and um, I had been seeing a therapist when I was trying to manage OCD. Um, so I went back to him afterward, but he's not really, his practice doesn't really deal with trauma. So I found somebody who specialized in things like PTSD. I spoke with her for a few months until I began to feel more comfortable. And then during COVID, I realized I should probably talk to somebody about this emotional component. So I found somebody who practices somatic experience therapy, which was really helpful in recognize. I kept trying to force the issue of wanting the emotional component to be present all the time.
Yeah.
And through the work with her, we were able to I was able to feel comfortable with where it's at, with the possibility that it may may strengthen over time. And also it just took enough time for me to feel comfortable with everything. So I feel like, I believe in the more of a dual model of grieving, where you're always going back and forth between restoration oriented and grief oriented. I spend more time now in the restoration oriented things. I don't really feel like I'm missing out on anything.
Yeah.
I titled part of what I wrote "Playing with House Money" because the rest of my life from here on out is gravy. So whatever happens, it's it took me a long time to get to this point where I look at everything like it's a potential opportunity.
Yeah.
But that's all really through the therapeutic process.
Like it's a gift. You've got a second lease at life. I know sometimes I think about people who have something horrible happen to them and they either feel like the unluckiest person on the planet and they get stuck in that. And I mean, there's no judgment there. I can completely understand how someone would feel like, I guess my life is over. And this, like, nothing that I pictured for myself is what I thought it was going to be. But then there are people we talk about all the time, right? Turning pain into purpose or just making peace with what is, which I guess is a very Buddhist concept. But it sounds like you've not only been able to make peace with what happened, but you're seeing it as an opportunity.
Yeah, this took a lot of time for me to feel comfortable with it and a lot of work. I don't want it to seem like suddenly one day I was, comfortable.
Right.
Buddhism actually helped a lot in the process of feeling more comfortable. And I read a lot of philosophy too, which was also helpful. But yeah, I still most of the time now try to recreate in looking at things with a positive spin.
Wow.
Or seeing how I can make the most out of it.
Let's jump on that, Andrew. So,
Sure.
You talked about how you thought your life would be, how it would change from writing a book, and you thought of yourself as getting married and having kids and raising a family. I am curious now, if you were to articulate your goals and your hopes for the future, what do you hope for?
That's a great question. I haven't. So, I think explaining more of the chronology of my life might answer some. But so, when COVID was happening and I was with my parents, I got the opportunity to think, okay, teaching's not really what I want to do as a passion, and writing is not going to transform my life. Is there anything out there I could do? And I realized that the few times that I felt exhilaration was if I connected with someone in a support group or on a message board about the recovery process. So I thought maybe I could get into being a psychologist or a counselor or something along those lines.
Sure.
So I looked into programs. I'm at the Chicago School in Washington, D.C. I'm hopefully going to complete my degree and my internship hours. And that kind of became something that I could find fulfillment with that I think a lot of what I had hoped for that my life would look like was conditioned from what I thought was important growing up. I think we're all sort of,
absolutely.
We're all sort of provided, this is the ultimate dream. This is the American dream. This is what you should put your sights on. So a lot of like, well, I need to get married. I need to have kids. I need to do this, stemmed from that. And the aneurysm, I think, allowed me to take a step back and look at things from a different perspective.
What perspective? Like, I'm so curious about like that getting to know yourself process of letting go of the old and taking on a new life philosophy.
And I'm almost hearing like you were able to get to a place where you're just really listening to yourself instead of what was socialized and integrated and pressured for you.
Absolutely.
And I can't even tell you how important I think that is, Andrew. I really think the goal is to live an honest life for whatever it is and try to challenge some of those myths about what we're supposed to be or what we have to do. Go ahead, please.
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm really lucky and fortunate. I never felt any external pressure for things. I think this was all pressure I put on myself.
Yeah.
But I'm sorry. Would you ask your question again, Talia?
Mm-hmm. Just like the idea of getting to know yourself as a new person. And I feel like you were a friend to yourself in this process and taking like an observational stance on like, oh, looks like I'm now into this and I'm now into that.
A lot of, I mean, when I was in graduate school for writing, I was so focused on publishing being the ultimate goal. And since then, I've sort of shifted to think of the process of writing and enjoying that as the ultimate goal. So I think a lot of what I realized is, well, in order to find that eternal happiness or fulfillment, you'll need to do the following things. Yeah. And I kind of changed the wording of that now. So now it's more like, well, you don't need to do this. You could do this and it might be enjoyable, but it's not mandatory.
And has your sense of joy shifted? Like, are you still feeling like you're joy focused or success or fulfillment? I hear you saying fulfillment as sort of the
well, that's that. I mean, one thing I've sort of realized, learned, read about, emotions are always fleeting, and if you try to do something that you think will make you happy, it may not have that result. So if you substitute fulfillment, it doesn't really matter what the experience is like, because that's going to change anyway.
I love that.
But you'll always be fulfilled. So that's sort of what I try to hunt for now. And I think I've managed to at least keep an open mind enough that I may not see the results immediately, but that's fine.
Yeah, I was going to say, Andrew, it's interesting because you're still early on in this process. Did you say you're 6 years in?
Yeah, it'll be in June. It'll be 6 years. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm very curious, what do you know about how generalized your experience is? Do you think this is common for people who survive an aneurysm?
Well, so what was difficult is that most people who had what I have don't survive. So there's not a lot of research about what the next step is. So I had to sort of learn to feel comfortable that whatever happened, what was happening was good. In most of the people who I'm still friendly with in support groups or through other programs who've had brain injuries are in much worse shape.
Wow.
Either in terms of what they can do. I'm fortunate that really the only thing that was affected was my vision and my balance. My cognitive processing is still the same. My memory is still fine. I have a lot of friends who had to retire and go on disability because they can't work. And if you would have told me 10 years ago, hey, you'll never have to work again, I would have thought, oh, that's great, because work is a job and that's an obligation that I'd rather have free time. Yeah. And now I sort of look at my friends who would love to go back to work. And I think, well, I have the chance to do that. And work doesn't have to be this, I used to joke with my students. Sometimes they would always roll their eyes. I would say the only time fun comes before work is in the dictionary.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good one.
But a lot of my perspective on how I view things has changed just because I've been given this sort of second chance, like you've mentioned, to just experience life through a different. I don't recommend anyone have a ruptured brain aneurysm, but
there are other ways to have.
There are a lot of other ways, but for me, it sort of forced my hand to have to reevaluate everything and look at it in a different way.
But I feel like that's so incredibly mature. And I guess I don't know for a fact because I haven't had that experience. But what I picture is that I would then, because if you have a horrible trauma and you feel blindsided by something that you didn't even know was possible, it wasn't even in the realm of possibility, I picture that someone wired like me might live in forever fear that now that I know that something like that can happen out of nowhere, I feel like I would be constantly looking over my shoulder, or like maybe I would develop some health anxiety of like every time I would sweat or like have a headache or, and I'm so
like impressed. It would happen again?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm so impressed with you. I feel like somehow, because I know you mentioned a history of OCD, which I do want to get to, but it almost feels like you have this existential peace instead of existential crisis and dread. And I just don't understand. I'm amazed.
If you had spoken to me a few years ago, I wouldn't be as confident as I am now. I mean, it really took a while to get to this point. Also, I probably, as a result of the aneurysm, I don't have that same fear. That's probably part of the emotional blunting that's happened.
Interesting.
That makes sense, though.
So, yeah, I mean, that's one of the more difficult things to articulate. The merry-go-round does a good job explaining the vision.
Mm-hmm.
Another good thing, when I was visiting my godmother, probably in 2019, and we were talking about, she was asking me questions about the future, and I said, look, that's really overwhelming me right now, and I'm not really prepared to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And she said, well, you're like a restored car. On the outside, you look fine, but the engine still needs a lot of work.
Oh, yeah, that's another good one. That's
how I try to articulate what it used to be like. I look fine on most people do. They look fine on the outside. But I've been able to tinker around and make the engine run pretty smoothly.
Yeah.
Again, it took about 3 years for that to happen. And then subsequently, I've been able to sort of negotiate obstacles as they arise much better because of the work I've done.
Yeah. Andrew, I appreciate that. I would not have wanted this to happen to you as well, but there is something about the ability to be more in the moment, to look at the future as kind of a gift. I have a incredibly dear friend who survived leukemia a few years ago, and every birthday she's like, I am so happy to be 1 year older. And I'm like, okay, well, that makes one of us. But it's kind of an interesting thing because, it's almost like what you're describing is what we as therapists would love people to experience. Try not to be worried about what other people are doing or what other people are, pressuring you to do. Just really focus on what's meaningful for you in this life to do. I want to go back to your comment about job. I think we in this culture, especially in America, we really value our jobs are our identity. And I will tell you, I'm one of those people that's grateful for having a profession that I really, really love and that I'm never going to tire of. And I hope to do till I die. If anyone will still talk to me when I'm staggering around.
When you're 98.
When I'm 98 in a couple of years. I know. But I'm very struck by this, Andrew, because you have this gift of being able to kind of be in that moment. And I'm just mesmerized by it. I want to also say that restoration, when you talk about restoration and you're not focused so much on grief, restoration is really, for some who believe in different theories about the grief process. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came up with the 5, but restoration is a 6th phase. Like the 6th phase in some theories is moving on and recreating your life and restoring in a new way. So I'm really digging how you talk about this. I want to know too, Andrew, like as you're talking to us about this, as you wear that amazing t-shirt, how do you feel talking about it?
I feel really comfortable talking about it. I mean, this has been such a major component of my life for the last couple of years.
Yeah.
It's still, so I had my aneurysm the week after I turned 40.
Wow.
And then obviously we've had COVID.
Yeah.
And my mother's ALS diagnosis. So my 40s have been very surreal.
Yes.
I joke about how if aliens landed next year, I wouldn't, bat an eye.
Nothing surprises you anymore.
That would be right in line with
You'd be like, yep, makes sense. So basically, you've made peace with the reality that anything and everything could happen. And I keep on thinking about this OCD. I was really dying to ask another question about the romance.
I'm also
too.
focused on a year from now when aliens do land. We want
they
him
will.
back. We want
be
him
like,
back
Andrew,
on the podcast.
how did you know? But I'm thinking about this, like the OCD, which we know is just like it's under the umbrella of anxiety and just a desperate need to regulate your anxiety in an emotional state, having everything as it should be, or having some obsessive thoughts about health or contamination, or if I can't do this, then this horrible thing is going to happen, which is literally the opposite of your new philosophy of, yeah, I'm ready to invite a Martian to dinner in 2026. If that, like, all right, bring it. Like, what's next? So I don't know. I'm curious about all of that and the OCD.
Sure.
And
yeah, well, so the OCD began, or when I noticed it really becoming a problem, was in 2008. And I think part of it was that I started working from home, and I wasn't going out as often. That's the only correlation I can think of that makes sense. For whatever reason, I became really hypersensitive to the fear that I was going to somehow contract AIDS from just touching things or being in contact with some. It didn't even have to be a person. It could just be a thing. It got to the point where when I was at school, sometimes I would ask students to open or close the door so that I wouldn't have to touch the doorknob.
okay.
And I did go speak to people about that. I had someone who helped for a while. Ultimately, what allowed me to kind of manage it was I was on Prozac. And that got rid of the impulses.
Okay.
Suddenly, I could touch a doorknob and not be anxious or overwhelmed by something. And again, a lot of times what helped me during these times that I would feel overwhelmed were sharing with colleagues what I was experiencing and having them sort of make light of it. The phrase doorknob AIDS was something that we spoke of often.
And that's not an easy thing to make light of.
No. I mean, a lot of, and again, with my mother having ALS, there's a lot of times that we use gallows humor to kind of take some of the wind out of the sails. So, yeah, I mean, OCD was very difficult for a few years until Prozac, and then it went away. Now, I still will sometimes get an inkling of something.
Okay.
But usually, I call this process ledging. Like I'm out on the ledge and I'm thinking of jumping, and all I need is for someone to just talk me back by an objective party just saying, oh, you touched that? Don't worry, you don't need to wash your hands. That's fine.
Yeah.
And then that is usually enough for me to say, okay.
Okay.
And then,
like you believe it makes sense to you.
Yeah.
You don't have to do the compulsion associated with
no. So I've gotten to a point, and again, I don't know if the aneurysm played any part in this. But after Prozac, I didn't really have symptoms. And then now it's to the point where it's noticeable sometimes, but it won't ruin my day like it used to.
It's really interesting to think about your brain, right? And whether the aneurysm changed some of the neurotransmitter activity or the functioning of your brain so that these impulses or tendencies are not there in the same kind of strength that they used to be. It's kind of interesting to see how your brain may have shifted, not only due to the Prozac, but the other pieces. One must assume that if something bursts, there's a change.
Yeah. Well, so, and this is to answer your other question. I'm not as concerned. I get regular CAT scans.
Okay.
I had an angiogram on the anniversary of the first year, and then every 2 years afterward, I have CAT scans, and they've all shown that everything is healed as well as it can.
Oh, that's beautiful.
What's interesting is my brother offered to read the description, because basically when I've gone back to have it done, the doctor has just said everything looks great. And I say, great. My brother said, has anyone ever read the details of this? And I said, no. He said, well, let me preface this by saying you're fine, but you're also missing certain because the dead tissue gets absorbed.
Wow.
So there are sections of my, not huge sections, but small sections where there was a bleed and pressure. So I am missing. So it is interesting to think about how, parts of my brain have probably rewired. Certain
Andrew,
things are gone.
What were the parts that were missing, or is that not a part of the story? Like, are there parts
I think part of the cerebellum is gone. I think I'm missing something. There is and this may not have been with the aneurysm, but there's a section that some people have and don't have. And I'm forgetting the name of it. But yeah, so it was interesting to hear that, because it also explained why things might be different.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which it seems like no matter what has happened and what that report might say, or what any future CAT scan might say, you have kind of taken on this stance of, I'm going to be resilient. I'm going to go with the flow. I'm going to manage this uncertainty. I'm really curious, what would you say to people who have to face an uncertain future? By the way, I work a lot with people who have survived HIV and AIDS and are long-term survivors. And it's kind of an interesting thing, because there is always that fear of the other shoe dropping or some other condition occurring. Please.
Right. Well, so growing up in New York City in the 80s, I think was what contributed partially to that being my fear.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But I'm sorry. Would you?
No, I'll rephrase it. Thank you so much for that reference, by the way. Pose was a show that Ryan Murphy did, and it very much focused on the 80s, I believe, in New York City. So I appreciate the reference. It's important. But I also want to say, Andrew, what my question was, like, I want to know what you think, you might tell our listeners and viewers about uncertainty, please.
Well, I again, for me, I had a different experience to that sort of forced me to arrive at this point and made certain things easier.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, and one of the things I'm hoping to practice when I become a counselor is a narrative therapy of reframing.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of it, and I often tell there's a Taoist parable of a farmer who finds a horse, where this farmer finds a stray horse on his land, and the farmer's neighbor says, "Oh, that's such great fortune. You have a free horse." And the farmer says, "Well, let's see how this plays out." So the farmer's son tries to train the horse, gets thrown and breaks his leg. And the neighbor says, "Oh, that's so awful. Your son broke his leg." And the farmer says, "Well, let's see." And the next day, the army comes to conscript all the young men of the town, and they can't take the farmer's son because he has a broken leg. And by then, the neighbors realized, like, oh, nothing is really good or bad in its own. It's our perception of it.
God, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're either the luckiest or the unluckiest, depending on the context and your narrative.
And I think we separate events from each other when it's really all one continuous event. So if you can realize, like, okay, things may look bad now, but it may not look so bad tomorrow. And there's always that chance that things may turn around, or there may be a silver lining or something. So I think giving yourself the benefit of the doubt of not passing judgment, regardless of what's happening, can be helpful. And over time, you learn to see the silver lining.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
and sometimes that silver lining is your narrative. But I think that, like, the part of the parable is like, well, let's see how it all plays out. Could be this, could be that.
Yeah. I mean, it took me a long time to feel comfortable enough to allow that to be the way I looked at things.
Yeah.
But getting there, it's been easier to deal with, difficulty, or if things don't go your way. I never would have described COVID as having a silver lining, but it did allow me to move back in with my parents and continue to fully heal. So they're there. They're difficult to see sometimes, especially if you are frustrated or angry. Or if I could have said all the time, why did this have to happen to me?
Right.
I used to joke, was I a former tyrant dictator in a former life?
Is this a punishment, karma?
Yeah, was I Idi Amin? And now I can laugh about that and, joke about that.
Yeah.
But it took a lot of work to feel comfortable that, things may not play out the way that I had assumed.
And Andrew, I think both of those things can occur at the same time. I think you can feel kind of screwed over, and you can go into that phase of like, why did this happen to me? But that's part of the expression. I think if we push that stuff down and we don't acknowledge that we have that grief process of anger and bargaining and, sadness and acceptance and all of the phases and that denial, like, how the fuck did this happen? I think if we don't acknowledge that doesn't complete our process either. But I think your ability to kind of take that, there's two things that I would say about that reframing that you're doing and taking a look from a cognitive perspective of like, all right, so this is not the worst. By the way, one of the things I love that you're doing is talking about this silver lining about the pandemic. I mean, Talia and I get to do telehealth now because we have the ability to see people and have it covered by insurance. My friend who has leukemia was kind of laughing because she's like, I have to stay isolated in my home. And so do you, Doug. And so it was kind of, it was kind of an interesting way of looking at this. But Andrew, I also want to say, before we kind of close this time, which, could go on and on and on, I'm delighted that you're joining our profession. I did not know that prior to this interview, so I'm excited for you to be a counselor. My eyes lit up a little bit. I'm always excited to hear people who want to join this profession, having been in it now 29 years.
And such a unique lived experience. I'm sure you have a tremendous amount of empathy for people who have had all sorts of curveballs thrown at them in their lives.
Well, and such an amazing sort of niche to help people kind of get to a place where you are. I think your resiliency and I think your sense of hope, and kind of because it's still a process, right? So you have this kind of like, let's just go and let's be grateful for what we have ahead of us. Tell us about your podcast. Tell us about how people might find you if they want to learn more.
Yeah, so I have my website is just andrew-davie.com. And that has links to all of my writing. Sometime a few years ago, I'll try to make this quick, I became friendly with someone who lives in Illinois. Her name's Heather. And we were both in a marketing program because I wanted to promote my book, which was independent. And she had an eBay store. So we became friendly through this marketing program. And one of the projects was you had to create a Facebook group. So she created something called Happy Hour with Heather and Guest. That was just a place where people could post about music they enjoyed. And when the pandemic hit, she pivoted and allowed it to be a space where bands could live stream perform from their rehearsal studios.
Wow.
And I offered to help because I thought that was a pretty major project.
Yep.
So originally we did this show where bands would just perform from their studios isolated, which is, we have a YouTube channel, so it's on YouTube. And then once bands began performing live again, we changed it to just be more of a review show. So now every Sunday, she and I will review, albums that are coming out from bands. It's usually heavy metal bands. That's our niche.
I do too.
And we've begun interviewing bands now. So we have one. There's a great band from Germany called Slow Green Thing. We talked to them about 2 weeks ago. So that's where you can find the link for the show, and then my writing. And then currently I'm living in my parents' house, helping to take care of my mother with ALS. And that's also provided this opportunity to just, let's see, how can I be helpful here, take care of her, take some pressure off my father. And for, again, all the pieces seem to line up. I could attend my school virtually. I could do my internship virtually because the practice was started during COVID. So all of these things kind of allowed me to be here. Plus, the emotional bluntness helps when things are bad with my mother.
Yeah.
If it's really overwhelming, I am not really affected by it, so I can sort of move it forward. So it's been a very interesting journey so far. And I'm still kind of curious to see what'll happen. Yes. We'll see if aliens do land. Who knows? But
I'm so curious.
If they do, you'll be back on the show.
Well, and yes, I also feel like I want you back on the show if and when you find yourself wanting to navigate the dating world again and thinking about like companionship or like how that's shifted for you. I'd be so curious to hear.
Yeah, I have a lot of great dating stories from post aneurysm. A lot. I'll leave you with this. It felt a lot like a Seinfeld episode where the question came up: when do you bring up that you've had a ruptured brain aneurysm?
Yes.
Do you say, "Hey, would you like to split the nachos?" By the way.
Yes, that's a great question.
I'm not feeling a lot about this date, nor am I attracted to you. Andrew, you just opened up this big can of worms, and I want another hour with you.
I know. This is what I'm dying to know too.
I'm happy to come back if you would be gracious enough to have me on. I would love to continue telling you everything.
Andrew, thank you. I do think there's a part 2. Honestly, you just said the thing about dating stories.
Don't you want to know?
I need a whole hour, and I think it's really interesting. So I do want part 2.
All right.
And Andrew, everything that you said, we're going to have in our show notes of where people can find you. And it's been such a pleasure. You are a remarkable person and a fantastic son. Yeah. And I'm also so glad that you're going to be out there in our profession helping people.
Yeah, I want to thank you as well, Andrew. One thing I really want to say to you is, despite the fact that you talk about like this emotional bluntness consistently, your insight is pretty astounding. And the way that you tell this story feels very present and very in the moment, and you put together the dots really well. I think whenever somebody misses 3 weeks of their lives, there's this sort of loss that feels like really kind of crazy. How does that happen? But boy, do you manage this well. And I just want to give you that encouragement to keep going.
Thank you. Well, I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. It's been really wonderful. And I look forward to sharing whatever else you'd like to hear in the future.
Yay! Part 2.
I know where I want to go.
Davie.
I know.
Well, thank you again so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Have a great day.
You too.
You as well. Take care of yourself. So we just, of course, had this interview with Andrew Davie about his experience. What I think is that sometimes, these stories just I get so into this mode of like, tell me your full story. And it would take like the whole podcast to just have somebody tell their story. But I found myself at the end, like when he said, I have a lot of dating stories. I'm like, oh my God, we need another hour.
Yes, that's what I wanted to know too.
I would like to have him back on and have a part 2 just on dating stories. When he said they were like Seinfeld episodes.
We need more.
That's hilarious.
It is hilarious.
I wonder if he's Elaine.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think? Oh, you think he was Elaine?
I'm trying to figure out
Kramer or Seinfeld.
I have no idea which one. I think one of the things we think is funny. We think dating stories, right?
God, I can't get enough, and especially bad ones.
And what he said was, and it was one of my questions. Like, if we had gotten into the dating a little bit, I would have said, so when do you disclose this? Because I think what we disclose and when we disclose, because we all have stuff to disclose.
When does that, by the way, come in? I know, I love it. You guys, if you enjoyed this episode, could you do us a solid? Just subscribe. Subscribe on YouTube. Subscribe on, look at what we're doing. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts. We're just rocking. We were in sync and now we're not. But please follow us. Subscribe.
For sure.
We love reviews.
We do.
We want new reviews. Anybody have thoughts, feelings? It'll take you 2 seconds. If you're listening to us right now, literally click a submit review. And if you're going to say something mean, just have it be anonymous.
It was kind of interesting. I was, this might go into our conversation at the beginning, but I was getting my tattoo and I referenced our podcast and then people started listening to it in the shop that I was at. And they said, you have 5-star reviews.
We do.
I'm like, damn, okay, thank you for letting me know. I don't look.
I feel like 70% of our listeners are because Doug walks around promoting word of mouth. He could be getting his eyebrows waxed, getting his teeth polished.
Eyebrows waxed.
That's me. He could be doing anything. He could be at a movie. He walks around and says things like, say, have you heard of that new podcast, We're Not Fine? Man, the lead guy's so hot. You should listen.
So it is kind of funny if you are a friend of mine, you know that I will be somewhere like the theater, or I was at the Guthrie one time and I'm like, I hear We're Not Fine is the best podcast to listen to.
And then do you look
I say
around
it really loud.
and look
and then
for eye
of course
contact?
If somebody actually looked it up, they'd be like, oh my God, it's him. And he's being a dick. Anyway.
That only makes it funnier.
We'renotfine.com, no apostrophe, we'renotfine.com. If you have any questions, anything you want us to address in this podcast, any issues you'd like us to comment on, any troubles you're having in your relationships, any mental health concerns, anything troubling you, feel free to write us. There's a place to submit questions. You can do it anonymously. You can put your name on it. We're not going to follow you. We're not going to identify who you are. But we absolutely 100% would like you to submit anything you'd like us to discuss.
That's right. And we have merch in case anyone wants a WNF t-shirt.
And I think we're going to be adding some.
Fun. Yeah, we want more merch.
We have a team that really loves some of our comments, like tell me more, or I commented about Jimmy Goat that I grew up with, and boy, that was a popular one.
And we love the We're Not Fine but vibe, which we'll have to throw one together at the end here.
Yeah.
Find us on social media. We've got Mr. at douglasljensen with an EN, and then I'm Dr. Talia Jackson, and We're Not Fine Pod. And yeah, YouTube, so you can always see our very empathic expressions.
Wow. That doesn't feel authentic to me. If you were my therapist right now, I'd say, I don't love that you're doing that.
This is how I am in therapy.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. Oh, wait, we're not fine, but
at least we don't have a therapist like Talia who is inauthentic in her questioning.
And I go like this with my mustache.
Yeah, well, that's what I do. And I actually have one, Talia. I don't know if, well, I guess you have one as well.
Do you know what my mom thinks I do in therapy?
Did you hear me?
No. It's like my true ADHD. I totally wasn't even registering that you were talking because I thought of something funny I was going to say. What did you say?
I'm not going to tell you again.
Damn it, I guess I'll have to listen to the episode. But my mom thinks that this is what therapy is.
What?
Because, she's from a generation and a culture, they don't necessarily.
What does she think therapy is?
Like, she thinks I have my legs crossed and all I'm doing is like stroking my beard.
And you're just letting people free associate as they sleep on the couch in a Freudian fashion.
Yeah.
I do have people who lay down on my couch, and I'm totally welcome to be comfortable in any way that people would like. But anyway, we're going to meander. So thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye, everybody.